Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory, 10th of October, 1836. Jonas Fletcher knelt beside the creek, carving the final stone for a pantry he'd dug into the hillside behind his cabin. A shaded intake pipe would draw cool creek air into the space, venting heat through a high outlet. The system required no ice, no constant fire, just the creek's steady 50-degree breath moving through stone. For a man living at 8,000 feet, where ice meant descending to the valley floor and hauling it back before it melted, this adjustment changed everything. Butter stayed firm. Cheese remained fresh through August. Milk didn't sour after 2 days. Other trappers still hauled ice blocks wrapped in sawdust, burning daylight and risking injury on steep trails. Fletcher's pantry used no fuel, required no resupply, and worked the moment he opened the intake vent. The numbers would prove decisive. A summer pantry needing no ice would shift the frontier's food storage equation across the entire Rocky Mountain region. The frost clung to the rafters inside Jonas Fletcher's first cabin in October of 1834, and he wiped his brow, watching his breath form clouds despite the fire roaring in the stone fireplace. The heat from the flames mixed with the cold air creeping through gaps in the logs. Ice formed on the interior walls 3 feet from the hearth. His water bucket froze solid overnight. Fletcher had arrived in the Wind River Valley the previous spring, a carpenter from Virginia seeking fortune in the fur trade. He'd built his cabin the way every trapper in the Rocky Mountains built theirs. Logs stacked tight, mud packed between gaps, stone fireplace at one end. Standard construction. Everyone did it that way. By February, he'd burned through 4 cords of firewood per month, 3 times what it should have taken. His hands were raw from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. Still, the cold seeped through those walls like they were made of paper. Worse, when spring arrived and the valley warmed, that same cabin turned into an oven. The thick log walls that couldn't hold warmth in winter somehow trapped every bit of summer heat. Sleep became impossible. The interior became a sweatbox. His food stores spoiled within days. Fletcher's diary from that first year survives in the collections of the Wyoming State Archives. The entries are brief, practical, and increasingly desperate. 15th of January, 1835. Burned 3 logs before dawn. Still cannot feel fingers. Butter melted near fire, froze hard as stone 6 feet away. Another entry from July. Milk soured before noon. Cheese sweating oil. Cannot work inside past morning. He wasn't alone in this problem. Every trapper, settler, and frontiersman building cabins in the mountains faced the same brutal reality. The standard cabin design that worked reasonably well in the lowlands and eastern forests became nearly unlivable in the extreme temperature. Swings of the high country. Summer days could hit 90 degrees. Winter nights dropped to 30 below. The same structure had to handle both. Traditional construction methods failed at that task more often than they succeeded. Spring thaw in 1835 revealed the extent of Fletcher's construction failures. The logs he'd cut in late summer had been full of running sap. He hadn't seasoned them properly. As they dried through winter, they shrank. Gaps opened between logs that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The clay chinking he'd used cracked during the first hard freeze in November, then crumbled away. The moss he'd stuffed in larger gaps dried out and fell out in chunks. Grass stuffed between logs became highways for mice. By March, Fletcher could see daylight through dozens of gaps. The cabin had cost him 3 weeks of construction time and approximately $15 in materials he'd purchased at the trading post in Fort Bridger: nails, a few iron brackets, glass for 1 small window. A reasonable investment by frontier standards. But the hidden costs were catastrophic. 4 cords of wood per month through a 6-month heating season meant 24 cords total. At 1 cord per day of hard cutting and hauling work, that represented 24 days of dangerous, exhausting labor. Labor he could have spent trapping, which was supposed to be his livelihood. The food spoilage in summer cost him even more. Fletcher's supply ledger, also preserved in the archives, shows purchases of butter, cheese, and cured meat at the Fort Bridger trading post every 2 weeks through the summer of 1835. Items that should have lasted months spoiled within days in his sweltering cabin. Other trappers managed slightly better, but not by much. A survey of fur trader journals from the Wind River Valley in the 1830s shows similar patterns: excessive firewood consumption, food spoilage, constant repairs to failing chinking, cabins that barely lasted 3 to 5 years before requiring major reconstruction. Fletcher spent the summer of 1835 hunting and trapping, making enough money to survive, but not enough to prosper. His mind kept returning to the cabin problem. There had to be a better way. The answer started coming together in the fall of 1835 when a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergstrom stopped at Fletcher's cabin while passing through the valley. Bergstrom had been in the mountains since the early 1820s. He looked at Fletcher's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. "You're cold here," Bergstrom said. It wasn't a question. Fletcher didn't bother denying it. "Colder than I've ever been. Can't figure why. Logs are tight, mostly. Got a good fireplace." Bergstrom walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed on logs, checked the chinking, examined how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Bergstrom's explanation was straightforward. Heat moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces, like a fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. Fletcher's cabin fought against every one of these principles. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. Rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually acted as moderate conductors. The cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. Bergstrom spent 2 hours explaining principles he'd learned in Scandinavia and refined through 15 years of Rocky Mountain winters. Position fireplaces in the interior. Use double-wall construction in the coldest areas. Seal every gap with durable chinking. Build with properly seasoned logs. Fletcher listened carefully. He'd already started planning his second cabin. That same autumn, a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow came through the valley with her husband, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Marot. They stopped at Fletcher's cabin to trade. Morning Crow took one look at his setup and laughed. "White men build cold houses," she said, in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as the common language of the mountain trade. "You make walls that breathe out warmth like old man breathes out life." Fletcher was getting tired of people telling him his cabin was terrible, but he was smart enough to listen when someone who'd survived winters in this country offered advice. Morning Crow explained that her people didn't build with logs the way white trappers did. When they made structures meant to last through winter, they used what she called 2 skins, an inner wall and an outer wall with air or insulating material trapped between them. The principle was simple. Air itself was actually a reasonable insulator as long as it didn't move. Trap air between 2 barriers and it couldn't carry heat away. But if you just had a single log wall, the air on both sides was in direct contact with the wood, allowing heat to transfer constantly. Add a second barrier with trapped air between, and you dramatically reduced heat transfer. Morning Crow also mentioned something Fletcher hadn't considered, that a structure could be designed to work with the seasons. In summer, you want hot air to leave. Make openings high where the hot air goes. In winter, you close the high openings. Make the hot air stay inside. Fletcher spent the rest of that autumn and early winter thinking about everything Bergstrom and Morning Crow had told him. By December, he'd worked out a plan for a new cabin. Fletcher started cutting logs in late fall of 1835, when the sap had retreated. He cut twice as many logs as he'd need for a standard cabin because his design called for double walls in critical areas. Each log was stripped of bark immediately. Then each log sat through winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation. By spring of 1836, when most of the moisture had left the wood, he began construction. The process would take 3 months, 10 times longer than his first cabin. The foundation came first. Fletcher's original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers at the corners and midpoints, raising the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. This created a crawl space that kept the bottom logs from ground moisture and provided a buffer of air between the cold earth and the living space. The floor itself was made from split logs, puncheons, laid flat side up over thick support beams. This created an actual wood floor, much warmer underfoot than packed earth, and provided better insulation from the cold below. The walls came next. Fletcher built the main structure with large, carefully fitted logs, each one debarked and hewn flat on top and bottom where they contacted each other. This was more work than using round logs, but it created much tighter joints with fewer gaps to chink. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced prevailing winter winds, Fletcher built a second wall 2 feet inside the main wall. This inner wall was made from smaller logs, also hewn flat. The 2-foot gap between the walls was filled with a mixture of dried moss, dry leaves, and forest duff, then more moss, then a final layer of clay mixed with grass. Multiple layers of trapped air and insulating material. Behind the cabin, Fletcher dug a pantry into the hillside. The structure measured 6 feet wide by 8 feet deep by 7 feet high. The walls and floor were lined with flat stones he'd hauled from the creek bed. The ceiling was heavy timbers covered with 2 feet of earth. But the real innovation was the ventilation system. Fletcher carved an intake pipe from hollowed logs, angling it down to creek level where it drew in air cooled by the water's constant 50-degree temperature. The pipe ran underground for 20 feet before entering the pantry through the lower portion of the back wall. At the top of the pantry's front wall, near the ceiling, he built a vent that allowed warm air to escape. The physics were straightforward. Cool creek air, being denser, flowed into the pantry through the intake. As it warmed from contact with stored food and the pantry's interior, it rose and exited through the high vent. This created constant circulation, a steady flow of 50-degree air replacing warmer air throughout the day. No ice required, no fuel consumed, just the creek's thermal mass doing the work. Fletcher tested the system in June of 1836. He placed butter, cheese, and a jug of milk inside the pantry and closed the door. The intake vent remained open. The exhaust vent remained open. The system ran continuously. After 3 days, the butter remained firm. The cheese showed no signs of sweating or mold. The milk was still fresh. After a week, everything remained in good condition. By contrast, identical items left in the cabin's interior spoiled within 2 days in the summer heat. The trading post at Fort Bridger sold ice at 25 cents per 50-pound block. At that rate, keeping a summer ice supply cost approximately $12 per season. Fletcher's pantry, built with materials from his own land and 2 weeks of labor, cost him nothing after construction. The chinking for Fletcher's second cabin required a fundamentally different approach. He'd learned that standard clay cracked in temperature extremes. Moss dried out and fell away. Grass disintegrated or became rodent habitat. Fletcher developed a new recipe. The base was clay, dug from a deposit near the creek and cleaned of organic material. To this he added coarse sand at a ratio of roughly 3 parts clay to 1 part sand. The sand provided structure and reduced cracking. Next came cow hair, which he obtained by trading with a settler's ranch down valley. The hair, mixed thoroughly into the clay sand base, acted as reinforcement. Thousands of individual fibers distributed stress and prevented crack propagation. The final ingredient was lime. Fletcher had learned from another trapper that adding a small amount of lime to clay chinking made it more resistant to water damage and temperature cycling. The lime created a mild chemical reaction that hardened the mixture. His final recipe was approximately 60% clay, 20% sand, 15% cow hair, and 5% lime by volume. He mixed it with just enough water to create a workable consistency, stiff enough to pack firmly, wet enough to shape. Application was critical. Fletcher wedged small split wood pieces tightly into each gap between logs first. This provided backing that prevented the chinking from simply falling through to the exterior. Over this wood backing, he pressed the clay mixture, packing it firmly to eliminate air pockets. As the chinking dried over several days, Fletcher added a second layer, filling any shrinkage cracks that had appeared. Then a third layer. By the time he finished, each gap was sealed with 3 distinct applications of his lime-enhanced compound. The result was chinking that remained flexible enough to accommodate minor structural movement, hard enough to resist impact and abrasion, and durable enough to withstand years of temperature cycling and moisture exposure. Fletcher positioned his fireplace in the interior of the cabin, approximately 4 feet from the north wall. This was unusual. Most mountain cabins built fireplaces against exterior walls because it was easier. The chimney could simply rise up the outside of the structure. But building the fireplace in the interior meant its thermal mass radiated heat into the living space from all sides instead of losing half that heat through the exterior wall. Fletcher built the firebox and hearth from carefully selected stones, flat ones for the firebox floor, rounded river stones for the upper structure. The stone chimney was thick and wide, creating significant thermal mass inside the cabin. He extended stone benches out from each side of the fireplace, creating places to sit that also served as additional heat-storing mass. The entire structure probably weighed 4 to 5 tons of stone, all positioned in the interior where its stored heat would radiate into the living space. The operating principle was straightforward. Fire a hot blaze for an hour or two, heating all that stone. The stone absorbed heat, then slowly released it over the next 8 to 10 hours. Fletcher could let the fire die down to coals or even go out completely, and the cabin would stay warm from the radiant heat of the stone mass. He'd effectively built a battery for warmth, charging it up periodically rather than maintaining a constant fire. The chimney itself incorporated a clever feature. Fletcher built it with a slight bend about 5 feet up from the firebox. This created a trap for rising smoke and heat, forcing it to interact with more stone surface before exiting. The result was better heat extraction and less warm air escaping up the chimney. A stone damper near the top could be partially closed when the fire was low, further preventing heat loss while still allowing smoke to escape. The first real test came in October of 1836, when an early cold snap hit the valley, dropping nighttime temperatures below zero. Fletcher lit his fireplace in the afternoon, building a hot fire that ran for about 2 hours. The stone mass heated up, radiating warmth throughout the cabin. By evening, when the fire had died down to coals, the interior temperature was comfortable, warm enough that Fletcher didn't need his heavy coat. He let the fire go completely out around midnight. When he woke at dawn, his breath still formed mist, but the cabin was nowhere near as cold as it should have been. The stone fireplace was still warm to the touch. The walls showed no frost on the interior. The temperature had dropped certainly, but much more gradually than in his old structure. Fletcher relit the fire. Within 30 minutes, the cabin was warm again. But the real test came in January of 1837, when deep cold settled in. Temperatures dropped to 30 below for several days running. Wind screamed across the valley at sustained speeds that made standing upright difficult. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried the lower portions of cabin walls. Fletcher ran his fireplace routine. Hot fire for a few hours each afternoon and evening, then let it die down overnight. The massive stone structure held warmth through the night. The double walls prevented cold from penetrating from the north and west. The tight chinking eliminated drafts. The raised floor kept ground cold from seeping up. Fletcher's diary entry from the 20th of January, 1837. 5th night of killing cold. Fire out since midnight. Interior bearable at dawn. Used 1/2 cord this week. Last winter, same period required 2 cords. The stone holds what the walls keep in. The mathematics of Fletcher's improvements were stark. His first cabin, burning 4 cords of wood per month during winter, required roughly 24 cords for a 6-month heating season. At the rate of 1 cord per day of hard cutting and hauling work, that represented 24 days of dangerous, exhausting labor. His improved cabin, using roughly 1.5 cords per month, needed only about 9 cords for the same period. 9 days of work instead of 24. That 15-day difference could be spent trapping, the actual work he'd come to the mountains to do. The fuel efficiency also meant less deforestation around the cabin. Areas where trappers and settlers clustered often showed heavy impact on local forests from everyone cutting firewood. Cabins that used less wood reduced that pressure. Word of Fletcher's cabin spread through the scattered mountain community during the winter of 1837 to 1838. Trappers traveling through the area stopped to see it. Some continued to mock the effort Fletcher had invested, but others began asking questions. How thick should the double walls be? How much thermal mass in the fireplace? What proportions for the chinking mixture? Fletcher shared his techniques freely. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. He was trying to stay alive, and if others could benefit from what he'd learned, that was acceptable. A trapper named William Crawford rebuilt his cabin in 1838 using Fletcher's double-wall technique and improved chinking. A French-Canadian named Remy built a hybrid structure with double walls only on the north side. A pair of brothers from Kentucky built their fireplace dead center in their cabin, creating stone mass so large it stayed warm for over 24 hours after the fire went out. By 1840, several cabins in the Wind River Valley featured variations on Fletcher's design. Fletcher's cold pantry lung proved equally revolutionary. Through the summer of 1837, he maintained detailed records of food storage performance. Butter remained firm and usable for up to 3 weeks in the pantry. By contrast, butter left in the cabin interior became liquid within hours on hot days and rancid within a week. Cheese stored in the pantry showed no mold growth for up to 6 weeks. Cabin-stored cheese spoiled within days. Milk kept in the pantry stayed fresh for 4 to 5 days. Cabin-stored milk soured within 48 hours. The creek-cooled ventilation system maintained pantry temperatures between 52 and 58 degrees throughout the summer, even when exterior temperatures reached 90 degrees. The constant airflow prevented moisture buildup that would have encouraged mold growth. Other trappers began building similar systems. A settler named Peter Johnson constructed a creek-cooled cellar using Fletcher's principle but adapted for vegetables and root storage. A trapper named Samuels built a smaller version specifically for butter and cheese storage. The economic impact was significant. Before Fletcher's pantry, mountain men either consumed perishable foods immediately, traded them quickly at significant loss, or watched them spoil. The ability to store butter, cheese, and milk for weeks instead of days meant trappers could purchase or trade for these items in bulk, reducing the frequency of expensive trips to distant trading posts. Fletcher's supply ledger shows that his trips to Fort Bridger dropped from every 2 weeks in the summer of 1835 to once every 6 weeks in the summer of 1837. Each trip required 3 days, a day and a half traveling each direction. Reducing summer trips from 12 to 4 saved 24 days that could be spent trapping or improving his homestead. The cold pantry lung, requiring no ice and no fuel, paid for itself within a single season. By the early 1840s, as the beaver trade collapsed and many trappers left the mountains, the knowledge of building climate-adapted cabins had spread throughout the Rocky Mountain communities. Settlers arriving in the region often found trappers' cabins with these features already incorporated, and they adopted the techniques for their own construction. A territorial survey conducted in 1843 documented construction methods in use across western Wyoming and eastern Idaho territories. The survey recorded 37 cabins in the Wind River Valley region. 23 used double-wall construction. 28 incorporated raised stone foundations. 31 used lime-enhanced chinking. 19 featured interior fireplaces with significant thermal mass. The specific methods continued evolving. Better chinking recipes, improved fireplace designs, more sophisticated ventilation systems. But the core principles remained. Build for the worst case, use thermal mass strategically, trap air for insulation, design for seasonal adaptation. Fletcher himself stayed in the Wind River Valley until 1843. The fur trade was dying, but he'd come to love the mountains and the valley where he'd learned his hard lessons. He married a Shoshone woman, Morning Crow's cousin, in 1840. They raised 3 children in his carefully built cabin. The cabin itself stood for over 40 years. It survived countless winter storms, summer heat waves, and the wear of daily use. When Fletcher finally abandoned it in the 1860s to move closer to one of his grown children, the structure was still solid, logs intact, chinking holding firm, stone fireplace as sound as the day he'd built it. Other settlers used the cabin for years afterward, recognizing the quality of its construction. The structure wasn't finally dismantled until the early 1900s, when the land was cleared for a ranch expansion. In 1967, a historical archaeology team from the University of Wyoming excavated the site of Fletcher's 1836 cabin. They documented the foundation piers, still intact after 130 years. They mapped the double-wall construction pattern, visible in the arrangement of rotted log remnants. Most remarkably, they uncovered the cold pantry, its stone walls largely intact. The intake pipe, though partially collapsed, was still identifiable. The researchers tested the system by temporarily clearing the intake and exhaust vents. Even after more than a century of abandonment, cool air flowed through the structure when the vents were open. The excavation team recovered several artifacts: iron brackets from the door, a section of lime-enhanced chinking that had survived in a protected corner, and portions of the hearthstone from the central fireplace. These items are now held in the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center. Fletcher's techniques weren't revolutionary in the sense of being entirely new. Double-wall construction, interior thermal mass, lime-enhanced chinking, passive ventilation. All these methods existed in various forms throughout different building traditions. What Fletcher did was combine them specifically for the extreme conditions of high-altitude mountain living. The real innovation was recognizing that a cabin didn't have to be just a box made of logs. It could be designed to work with natural heat flows, to store and release warmth strategically, to preserve food without fuel, to adapt to seasonal changes. Jonas Fletcher died in 1881 at the age of 72, having lived far longer than most mountain men of his era. His cabin-building techniques influenced frontier construction across the Rocky Mountain region for generations. The cold pantry lung remained the most elegant solution, a passive cooling system requiring no ice, no fuel, no maintenance. Just creek-cooled air and careful stonework, keeping milk sweet through the high country summer.